Okay, let's talk about the extension topic, which will come at the end of our paper. You will have 2 questions on a possible 3 topics. Our 3 topics that could crop up are witchcraft, the role of witchcraft in crime and punishment, conscientious objection in the First or Second World Wars, or domestic violence. Let's have a talk about conscientious objection. Conscientious objection only becomes an issue in the 20th century, in the First World War, in the middle of the First World War. Sorry. Why is that the case? Because prior to that, in all the centuries before the First World War, British armies in the main had been volunteers. They had signed up of their own free will. They weren't coerced into fighting for their country. However, the nature of the First World War, the duration of the First World War, means that halfway through the First World War, Britain needs to conscript people to join the army, and this conscription is made law under the Military Service Act of 1916, which is 2 years into the war. The war starts, of course, in 1914, and Britain then had relied on volunteers, but halfway through the war, the scale of the war, the scale of the casualties, the amount of people that are dying, means that this is no longer a viable way to get people into the army. So they begin to force people to join the army under conscription, under the Military Service Act. But when Parliament was laying out the Military Service Act, Quaker MPs made sure that there was a clause within it that allowed for people with some conscientious objection to war to give them a get-out clause, if you like. And when the Military Service Act is passed in 1916, there are 16,000 people who say, I'm not going to fight. And of this 16,000 people, a minority, 1,500, refuse to have anything to do with fighting whatsoever. And they become known as absolutists. They will have absolutely nothing to do with the war effort. On the other hand, the majority of COs, or conscientious objectors, fall into the other camp. They are alternativists, or non-combatants. They are prepared to aid the war, whether that's working in a factory, working on a farm, or working as an ambulance driver or a stretcher bearer. They are prepared to help the war effort, but they are not prepared to kill another human being. And of the 2 groups of people, the absolutists are the ones who are treated most harshly, if you like, and they are seen as cowards, as traitors, not prepared to do their bit for the country, and I think it's fair to say that they are loathed and reviled by the British public and are treated with contempt by the authorities, but also generally by the British public. How are they treated? Many are taken to prison, where they are brutalised inside the prison, made to do hard labour. In fact, 10 of them will die in prison because of the treatment that's meted out to them. Some are taken over to France, where the fighting is taking place, and if they get within a certain distance of the front line, they come under direct military authority, which means that they could be, in theory, shot for cowardice. And some soldiers are taken over to France to try and force them to fight, to try and put pressure on them. They're treated in a brutal way. So the general attitude towards conscientious objectors is that they do have this get-out clause within the Military Service Act. They have to prove that their reasoning is just, and they can apply under religious grounds, under political grounds, or under ethical grounds. But they have to prove their case to a military tribunal, and the military tribunal is drawn up generally by professional men, by clergymen, by solicitors, by doctors, but there will always be a military person on the tribunal, which again means that in effect the tribunal is biased against the person seeking to be a conchi. Conchi, of course, is the derogatory term used by the public for these people who they see as cowards, basically. That's the situation in the First World War. What happens 20 years later? Well, between the First and Second World Wars, there's a growing sense of pacifism. The First World War has not achieved anything. It was futile. All the losses were for nothing, really. And so that meant by the time the Second World War broke out in 1939, the amount of people claiming conscientious objection had tripled. It was now nearly 60,000, I think it's 59,000 people applied for conscientious objection in the Second World War. What was the reaction of the authorities to this? I think it's fair to say that their attitude was more lenient towards those people claiming conscientious objection. How do we know this? We know that the nature of the military tribunal was changed. There was no longer a general or a colonel sitting on that tribunal, so therefore it's more even-handed, more fair if you like. We also know that the Prime Minister of Britain at the outbreak of the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain, had written that we should treat conscientious objectors with respect, we should honour their views, and we should not seek to humiliate them or punish them in any way. So this shows us that at the very top of government, people had respect for conscientious objectors. Who were these conscientious objectors? Lots of them were members of the Quakers, and as we know, the Quakers are a Protestant religious group dedicated to pacifism, and many of these Quakers formed an organisation during the Second World War called the Peace Pledge Union, and this union was dedicated to try and bring in the hostilities to an end. So we know, and they were tolerated, they weren't put in prison. The big difference between the First World War and the Second World War in the treatment of conscientious objectors is that they are treated much more leniently. They're allowed to do work on farms, in factories. They are not sent to prison, they are not made to do hard labour. So generally the attitude of the authorities is much more lenient towards conscientious objectors. Is it the same with the public? To be honest, no. The public, as in the First World War, tend to see the conscientious objectors in the main as cowards, not prepared to do their bit for the country, not prepared to put their lives on the line for the freedoms that all English people enjoy, etc. So a big difference between the First World War and the Second World War. In the First World War, the authorities are very harsh towards conscientious objectors. In the Second World War, the government is much more lenient, much more willing to tolerate people's views and opinions, and the system is designed to allow them to object to the war. On the other hand, both in the First World War and the Second World War, the public is generally very hostile to conscientious objectors. Okay.